I'm very pleased to be here this evening, and it's great to see such a great turnout for this event. Right now, in The Hague, in the Netherlands, there is a gathering of over 1,000 women, and this is the 100th anniversary to the day of the Women's Peace Congress, which Lauren has already mentioned, which was organised and led by a group of women from across Europe and North America. They were feminists, they were suffragists, they had all in their own countries and societies been involved in the struggle for women's votes, but broader than that, they were women who had a vision of democracy and equal citizenship. They were looking and claiming the right for a voice in all public affairs and decisions, whether local, national, or international. And they made a very explicit connection between the women's movement, which had been, going for at least half a century, and the campaign for the vote likewise. And they made the connections between that movement and the movement for international peace and non-violence. They were in the minority, of course, as we know, during this time when the world was at war, and they were in the minority even within their own feminist suffrage movement. But both constitutional suffragists and militants came together to campaign and to take very specific, direct action, planning, agency to say that what was happening around them was madness and that there had to be a better way, a non-violent way to resolve conflicts. In fact, when these women were meeting in The Hague, really just 100 miles away, there were young men slaughtering each other at Ypres. It was during that terrible battle of the war. I want to tell this story really through the eyes of two Scotswomen, two absolutely remarkable Scottish women. When the slideshow is going round, you'll see pictures of them. Great, thanks. The first one is Crystal Mcmillan. I'm wondering how many folk have heard of Crystal Mcmillan? Yay. But that's very sad for me that so few women or so few people in Scotland are aware of this woman and what she did. In 1914, she was 42 years old. She had registered at Edinburgh University on the first day that it was possible for women to matriculate. That was in 1892. She was a brilliant mathematician and scientist. She graduated in science and then in law. Earlier, in 1908, she led Scottish women graduates all the way to the House of Lords to make their claim that they had a right to the vote as Scottish graduates, and she gained a bit of notoriety in the process. But at this time, 1914, when the war broke out, Crystal, as a committed feminist and internationalist, was utterly, horrified and despondent. But she didn't just sort of, say, oh, well, this is what's happening. She was determined to take action to challenge what was happening in the world. Along with friends and colleagues from the International Women's Suffrage Alliance, they did everything they could to keep in touch with one another in these early days of the war, when contact and communication was becoming increasingly difficult, and when there was widespread paranoia, of course, about those who weren't considered patriots. This International Women's Suffrage Alliance had met over the years and was quite a strong association of women representing 26 different national suffrage societies. They were due to meet in Berlin in 1915. It was clear that that couldn't happen. The Dutch women then said, as they were living in a neutral country, that they could gather in Holland in order to just kind of keep in touch with one another. But it was Mcmillan from Scotland who made a very direct and personal proposal to each one of these 26 societies that the meeting that they had in Holland should actually spend the bulk of its time discussing the principles on which peace should be made and how action could be taken internationally. She suggested topics for discussion including international arbitration, democratic control of foreign policy, disarmament, and the federation of states. Well, there's a story, behind the planning and organisation of this event, but 180 women from Britain applied to attend. I don't know if you know that before the First World War, there were no passports in Britain. It was an innovation during the war to regulate and to control freedom of movement. And the government refused these women their permits to travel to The Hague. Fortunately, Mcmillan and two other women from Britain were already in Holland because they had been planning this event. So they were the 3 British women among over 1,000 who took part in this remarkable Congress. And of course, there's a story about the Congress as well, which, I don't have time to go into, but I think it's worth just sharing with you what these women resolved after all their discussions. They came up with 20 resolutions, and I'm not going to read them all, you'll be pleased to hear, but the first, I'm going to just share a few with you. That no land should be transferred without the consent of the men and women in it, and the right of conquest should not be recognised. That autonomy in a democratic parliament should not be refused to any people, and women should be granted equal political rights with men. That governments should refer future international disputes to arbitration or conciliation and bring social, moral and economic pressure to bear on any country which resorts to arms. That there should be democratic control of foreign policy with no secret treaties. That there should be universal disarmament. The establishment of a permanent international conference at which women would be fairly and equally represented, with the authority to settle international differences arising from economic competition, expanding commerce, increasing population, and changes in social and political standards. And that there should be representatives of ordinary women and men who would take part in the final peace conference at the end of the war that was currently raging. I hope you'll agree with me that 100 years on, most of these resolutions are still as relevant, if not more so, than they were in 1915. So they didn't just leave it at that. They decided to act, and they sent 2 delegations to visit the heads of state of the belligerent nations and the heads of state of the neutral nations in order to lobby for their proposal that a conference should be set up to resolve the conflict non-violently and to bring an end to the war. And Mcmillan was the leader of the delegation that visited the neutral nations. They spoke, or attempted to speak, to 21 heads of state. You know, when you think about the conditions of the time and when you think about the status of women at the time, this was really quite an incredible action on, and a kind of commitment and a voice saying, there is a different way of doing this and you should be listening to us. As we know, they didn't prevail, but they met again in 1919 at the same time as the peace negotiations were going on in Paris. These women met in Zurich, and they came up once again with a very radical manifesto for peace. And it's no surprise that they weren't involved and they weren't directly invited to what was happening in Paris at the end of the war. And if the Paris negotiations had paid any heed at all to what they were proposing, we may well have avoided the Second World War and the conflicts that followed thereafter. 100 years later, only 3% of those who are actively involved in peace discussions and peace settlements in conflicts, in recent conflicts, only 3% have been women. So things have changed very little. But the organisation that Crystal and her colleagues established, which became known as the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, has continued for 100 years, campaigning not just against war, certainly against militarism, but really challenging the root causes of war and conflict and violence. Have I got time to tell about Helen Crawford? Just go back to the years of the war. And although there was this kind of top-level international negotiation going on, around Europe and elsewhere, local groups of women came together to lobby and to campaign and to educate themselves and others for an end to war and to resist war in their own societies as well as internationally. They were rather cautious and moderate in their approach, it would have to be said, but given the context in which they were having to operate, perhaps that's not altogether surprising. They worked very closely with other anti-war organisations, including the Union for Democratic Control, the No Conscription Fellowship, and the Independent Labour Party. There were many branches of the Women's International League around Britain and in Scotland. The one that was established here in Glasgow was one of the key people involved in that was Helen Crawford, who had been a militant suffragette, a socialist, and was utterly committed to resisting war and resisting militarism and conscription, not just conscription of boys and men into the military to fight wars, but the conscription of industrial society to provide the war machine. And she was very involved in all the labour disputes and was really one of the leaders of Red Clydeside and all that happened during the war here in Glasgow. Helen was very supportive of her sisters in the Women's International League group in Glasgow. However, as a veteran of the militant suffrage campaign and a very committed socialist and friend of Mary Barber, in whose room we are meeting today, Helen was determined to challenge the warmongers, not just in this kind of polite constitutional way, but by taking grassroots action, by getting out on the streets, by encouraging women from Govan, from Partick, from Maryhill, from really the working class areas of Glasgow, the surrounding towns, and then spreading through the central belt of Scotland and on into England and Wales. They established this amazing movement called the Women's Peace Crusade. And they were, the Women's Peace Crusade organised rallies that included thousands of people. They passed resolutions. They took on, in a very direct and confrontational way, not just the city councillors here in Glasgow, but David Lloyd George, the government, the leader of the wartime government, and also took on their once colleagues and comrades, the Pankhursts, Mrs. Pankhurst and her daughter Christabel, who were among the most jingoistic of patriotic supporters of the war. It's a great story, and there's so much that could be said about Helen and about Crystal. But it's really good to know that 100 years on, that movement that really began with Crystal's initiative has spread around the world. women from the global south, and the gathering that is taking place in The Hague now is both a congress and a conference. And today, I've heard there are several Scots who are there, including Penny Stone. I don't know if anyone knows Penny Stone. She's a singer. And she's out there getting people to sing. But she's been posting all day about what's been going on. And one of the key things that's happened at the Women's International League Centennial Congress today is that women got out onto the streets of The Hague and made what they called a manifestation against the arms trade, against militarisation, and for all kinds of initiatives to bring social, economic, gender and racial peace and justice. There's a film about this story, the story of 100 years ago, called These Dangerous Women, and if you're interested, you can find that online. What Penny was saying to me today was that that women from the global south were calling for the UN Security Council countries who produce 88% of weapons in the world to stop making those weapons and to pull back the curtain that says war jobs are good jobs. They called for not tanks but school buses for Pakistan. And they called for disarmament so that women could put food on their table and send their children to school. And they sang with Penny, "We shall overcome," and Bella Ciao in many, many languages. I think it's great to set the rest of tonight's proceedings and tomorrow in the context of this great witness for peace and the courage and the imagination and the vision of these women, and we should be proud of them. Thanks.